This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is joining me remotely from Southern California, Ryan Crisp, director of brewing ops for Alesmith Brewing in San Diego. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
Hey, welcome. Thanks for having me.
I've been a longtime fan of Alesmith. I've bought a lot of Alesmith beer. You guys have shipped us a lot of Alesmith beer. Used to covet those bottles of Alesmith barrel-aged Speedway and whatnot. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because we are currently working on the Stout issue of the magazine. And so, when this idea we came across this, I thought, you know what, this is a fantastic conversation to have at this point in time to talk about Stout brewing, to talk about adding things to Stout, which you all do so well within that kind of Speedway family. If there is a coffee that exists on this planet, I am pretty sure that you have added it to Stout. And
probably.
And so we're going to delve into that. I know it seems like weirdly off season to talk about Stout and coffee and whatnot right now, as it is like record heat wave on the West Coast.
That's true. There's no bad season to talk about Stout, though, I don't think.
I 100% agree with you. Stout season is year-round these days. So we're going to focus the conversation around Stout. But before we do that, like your flagship beer, you can rely on G&D chillers for the same quality and consistency. G&D guarantees that every chiller they build will hit 28 degrees without breaking a sweat. They never stop. They draft, they craft, they service each and every brewery, big or small, all in an effort to build one hell of a chiller. For nearly 30 years, G&D has been committed to cold. Reach out today for a quote at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by Sativa from BSG Hop Solutions. Meet the latest in the BSG Hop Solutions portfolio, Sativa. Strong expressions of stone fruit, floral, and resinous pine flavors and aromas define this blend, crafted specifically for use in hazy IPAs and other hop-forward beers. Sativa is ideal for aroma, whirlpool, and dry hop additions to hazy and juicy IPAs, or for any other hoppy styles where a combination of citrus, tropical fruit, and pine aromatics are desired. Go to bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn more or call 1-800-374-2739. So Ryan, give me the background on your brewing history, how you got to where you are, and maybe touch on just a little bit of Alesmith history too while you're at it.
Yeah. Well, I started brewing as a home brewer, I think like many. It was always something. I love craft beer. The process just kind of fascinated me. But Alesmith started in 1995, so long before I kind of got into the game. Real small operation, old dairy and winery equipment just kind of cobbled together in a little warehouse in San Diego. It was taken over by our current owner, Peter, in 2002. I came along in 2006 just to visit the brewery and check it out, and I asked if there were any interning opportunities, and it was my lucky day. So I was able to help out for a summer, and when a position opened up, thankfully, I got on board. So it's been about 15 years since then. We were about 800 barrel brewery when I started. We're doing about 35,000 now. So it's been a long, fun ride.
Yeah, no, that is quite a ride. And so the beer that Alesmith has made along the way, what were the kind of classic cores as you started, and how have you kind of, over that kind of time, how has that lineup changed, shifted, or even further developed?
Yeah, I think like most older craft breweries, our lineups definitely evolved over time. I mean, the idea when the brewery was founded was to do modern American takes on classic European styles. So our flagship back then was our ESB, which is still one of my favorite beers. We did an extra pale ale. Speedway has been around from the early days because that technically is a classic European style, just Americanized, made bigger and better. That as time's gone on, our tastes have evolved with the market, I think. So we make more hoppy beers. Hops have become more readily available, and the quality's become better and better. We're really excited about those. We're making awesome hazy beers. But we still, in our taste room, play around with the older styles. They're just not as popular with consumers anymore, but we still love them.
You make them for your own love. No, I remember
Absolutely.
the old Yule Smith IPAs, and oh my gosh, the Scotch Ale was one of my favorites back in the day.
Really heavy. Yeah, you can still find those if you come to our tasting room. We do those in the seasons, different seasons.
Last time I was out there, you were making the transition from the old tasting room into the new one. And the new one wasn't quite open yet. I think, they had been built, and I think we popped out in the parking lot and got to see it. But we're still over at the old tasting room, to buy beer. So that tells you how long it's been since I've been out that way.
Yeah, a little while.
But I'll need to make another trip soon. Well, let's talk a little bit then, about Stout. So Speedway, was this kind of, and not to, there's plenty of other great Alesmith beers out there, 394 Pale Ale and other things that you've since launched, from those early days, that are also great beers. But I think, given how important that Speedway is just a beer in the world of beer. There are not as many stouts, I think, like it that have achieved that kind of iconic status. There certainly are others, but that is one of those that when I think about a stout with coffee in it, it's like Speedway is just that go-to beer. Like it is just a classic. Talk to me about over the, since the time that you've been involved in Alesmith, how you all have kind of shepherded that growth along. Or I guess maybe we should back up before that and talk about what are those core tenets of Speedway? How do you all think about it as a beer? What are the parameters that are consistent? What are the parameters that change? And what do you all feel is that kind of core identity to Speedway?
Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at it. And I don't think we usually think about beers in those terms, but Speedway started in the 90s, not long after Alesmith was founded. The beer has kind of evolved over the initial years. I think it started as like an 8% beer before it became a 12% beer. And then using coffee beer was unheard of at the time. So dialing that process in has been kind of an adventure since it was started. But I think for us, the core things about the beer is balance. So we don't want it to be too sweet on the finish. And for a 12% stout, that's probably the most difficult part. Getting it to finish around 6 or 7 Plato. We don't want to add too many fermentable sugars that aren't from barley. So we don't want to add a lot of dextrose or corn sugar, because that will change the flavor. We want it to be roasty, but restrained a little bit. So it's a balance of flavors. It's a balance of sweetness and the perception. And then we want the coffee to kind of jump out in the aroma and kick in the end. I think of all the parts of the beer, the coffee is probably the hardest part to make consistent, just because coffee beans are less consistent than barley crops. So as coffee changes, as different coffees become available or others aren't available any longer, we've had to kind of evolve and do different blends and cuppings with roasters to try to nail down the profile that we're going for.
Sure. You mentioned that sweetness and getting that down to a level of dryness. Now, the other piece of that is that it needs to be dry, but also not taste acrid or sharp or, otherwise, come across as too acidic. All of these kinds of, pieces that can come when you are using, roasted coffee and roasted barley. Talk to me a little bit about that balancing act, of pushing that dryness without it being perceived as so dry that it heightens the kind of negative impact of some of these other sharper flavors in the beer itself.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all had stouts that were acrid and ashtray and burnt, and we've probably all had stouts that tasted like wort as well. And sometimes those beers can be great. Well, what we were looking for was something that was in the middle of the two. We didn't want it to be heavy. We currently sell it in 16-ounce cans, so we want it to be a beer that if you want, you can have a can of in a sitting without it completely blowing your palate apart and you feel crappy afterward, even though it is a big beer. But we also didn't want it to be, it's just super dry and the malt and chocolate flavors just are lost and it becomes very, very ashtray and charry. And then the coffee would just come off the same way. So that is a challenge. It's a challenge making sure that it's fermented consistently. The yeast is super important. The oxygen level at knockout super important for that beer because it can go wrong pretty quick, and then when it goes wrong, it goes real wrong. You could end up with basically wort after fermentation.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about the kind of, building a malt, base component for that stout, because again, some of that can help, push this idea of sweetness without it being actual sweetness. And I think, building some of that kind of layered approach to it is probably a piece of this kind of equation. How do you all go about, building that up from base malt up?
Yeah, that's a good question. Our older beers, Speedway, you mentioned, those European styles they're often much more malt forward, with a few exceptions, obviously. So for those beers, we usually will start by building the malt component of the recipe first. And it's a very complicated recipe, Speedway. It has different toasted malts. It's got roasted barley. It's got chocolate. It's got caramel malts. So it's not just, one or two different things. To get the complexity and the layers of flavor, it takes a lot of different malts. And it could be, if you want to add crystals, you don't just add a ton of one thing. You may add a couple of different kinds to provide, nuance. I think
so. It's a homebrewer's recipe where you
basically. Well, that's how Alesmith kind of started. But yeah. I think there's something to that, though. I mean, most larger craft breweries are, you want to simplify, understandably. You want to cut costs. But for a beer like that, you couldn't. If you stripped out those other components that don't seem like they're having as much of an impact, you'd realize they were.
No, we joke about it, but Corey King has said the same thing, on the podcast. Like, it is, some of the beers that people love the most out here in the world are some of these more complex, especially in this world of stouts, are some of these complex recipes, because you really just can't substitute out for some of those multiple layers. Well, without giving away too many of your secrets, are there some specific ingredients along the way that you find yourself leaning towards, or and I imagine we're talking about a lot of base malts still, and then small percentages of each one of these specialty malts. Are there some cool or crucial pieces that you find add really interesting flavors in the kind of middle spectrum of the beer?
I think every malt in it plays a part. So I don't think there's not one that's more important necessarily. But I think you have to have some, for a beer like that, you have to have some sort of caramel malt component. And I think it's important to have some sort of toasty or biscuity type malt as well, to provide some more nuanced malty flavor as opposed to just being base malt and roasted malt. But I think the hardest things to nail down a beer like that is the dark malt, though. We use roasted barley and chocolate malt. It has a ton of roasted barley in it, but it's not, you wouldn't drink it and describe it as extremely roasty, I don't think. And that's at least what we're going for. So trying to balance those malts, which can come off very unpleasant if you overdo it, and if you underdo it, it's not the same beer, right?
Yeah.
So that, I think that can be the hardest part in designing a recipe like that.
When you say it's really heavy on roasted barley, rough percentage wise, what does that end up being in the recipe? I'm going to put you on the spot here.
You put me on the spot. Like, I got it all memorized.
You mean you don't commit this kind of stuff to memory?
I don't know. I don't think I know exactly off the top of my head.
Sure.
What it is, but it's. I remember when I started and I had homebrewed plenty of stouts. It was more than I was expecting for what the beer tastes like. It's definitely roasty, but it's not as roasty as that you think from what is in it.
Now,
there's a lot of beer to balance.
As you've been involved, with Alesmith over the last 15 years, those ingredients certainly are not the same now that they were then, whether it's, equipment from maltsters, or just what they're offering, how they're processing. Sometimes maltsters improving their equipment changes those ingredients. And for you all, you're a relatively large operation. Well, not huge, but a good sized operation, and you're working with a lot of these ingredients regularly. As these ingredients change from year to year, season to season, or, every couple of years, talk to me a little bit about that process that you all go through to evaluate these as they come in, or if somebody stops making something and you need to substitute something new in to accomplish that same kind of, flavor in the middle. Talk to me a little bit about how you all go about that, especially, when you're talking about an icon like Speedway. It's not a small thing to evaluate some of these ingredient changes and think about some of the way that these changes happen.
Yeah, absolutely. We treat all the raw materials, malt and hops, similarly because they all change season to season and whoever you buy them from. But we make malt teas pretty regularly, which is ASBC. They have a method for it. It's a pretty good way of being able to try the malt without getting as much of the husky material that you're not going to get in the finished product. And so we'll do them through our sensory panel blind. And then sometimes we'll see that the malt we're using is not the one that we picked. I think originally the beer favored more continental European maltsters, the classic Simpsons and Crisps and all those. I think as time's gone on, what we've seen is American maltsters have improved quality enough where they can now compete or even be better than some other continental options. And so that's really allowed us to work with people who are closer, reduce our imprint with shipping across the world for certain things. But we're always
which now in this year seems really smart.
Yeah, absolutely.
When larger brewers are trying to hoard any of those imported ingredients right now that they can potentially find, just because shipping and everything else is the world's gone crazy around that. Right. That does make sense. So a hop tea process is how you keep an eye on these things. How often, do you guys do that kind of thing? That's interesting and curious.
Yeah, I think probably more often for hops because the variability crop year to year can be pretty significant and farm to farm. So we do those annually with each new crop. And aside from selecting the hops that we use, at the farm, we'll also do that at the brewery so we can kind of see the impact in our beers. For malts, it's a little less often, probably every couple of years, or unless we find something that we're really excited about that's we're not using, or our supply becomes unavailable for whatever reason.
Have there been any bigger shifts in that kind of malt component of the beers? Some moments where, obviously if you've moved it over time from 8% to 12%, it's definitely gotten bigger along the way. But were there any, moments there where it took some, hey, let's really either, thicken this up in the middle, or, the taste is moving away from, this kind of, harsher roast, or, hey, we have this coffee, that's going to provide some of this edge that we now no longer need from the malt itself. Have there been some moments like that where you've done some more serious tinkering with it?
Yeah, I think there are with all our beers. If we weren't tinkering, we wouldn't be good brewers. Not that we want to change everything, but we want to maintain it.
Right. For it to be the same, it needs to change because the way that people perceive these things, their palates are always changing too. Right.
The recipe itself has stayed pretty consistent over time. I think that what's changed more than anything is the process. I think it's gotten better. Really dialing in the fermentation is one of the huge keys to the beer. It's, like I said, it's very difficult to get it to ferment out as far as we want it to. And it just takes kind of everything going right. And it took a lot of testing, measuring, trying, sensory panel to get to that point.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about that fermentation. But first, a brewery might have 99 problems, but your fruit supplier shouldn't be one. Old Orchard is already known for their high-quality concentrates, but they also pride themselves on consistent product and reliable supply. When brewers need assistance, Old Orchard is just an email, phone call, or even a text away. Based in Greater Grand Rapids, Michigan, better known as Beer City, USA, Old Orchard is core to the brewing community. To join their fruit family, learn more at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, with nearly 20 years of innovation and experience, Brewmation specializes in electric, steam, and direct fire brewhouses, complete cellar solutions, and automated controls for the craft brewing industry. From a half-barrel to 30-barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and brewing style. Whether you're starting a new brewery, upgrading your cellar, or just need some parts to keep you up and running, Brewmation has you covered. Visit them at brewmation.com to get started. So, Ryan, you've mentioned it twice now that getting it to ferment to where you want it to go is the biggest challenge. Let's talk a little bit about that. Obviously, yeast choice plays a big role in that. Temperature care, cell counts, all matter in that kind of equation, for you. And there are certainly yeasts that you could use that would ferment it down to wherever you want it to go. Heck, you could just, pitch some quake yeast in there and it'll rip right through everything, right?
Sure.
But talk to me a little bit about how you balance that, how the yeast expression that you're looking for to help complement the flavors that you're going for, means that you're making a yeast choice that has to be cared for, in other ways along within that fermentation process. Just walk us through what that looks like for you all.
Yeah, well, we've tried different yeasts long ago, but our goal has always been to be able to use our house ale yeast for this beer, which is basically the equivalent of like an American ale, just a clean West Coast type of yeast. So the real challenge,
which makes sense from a production standpoint, because you're making pale ale and you've got or ESBs and you're creating plenty of commercial starters for this to get it up to the kind of level, to put it into a beer this big. So all of that certainly makes sense.
Nothing living is coming out of this beer either. So you'd be using a pitcher bowl for every batch. So
speed line is the finish line.
Exactly. So so this beer, like all our beers, were originally fermented in open top horizontal fermenters, which definitely helps with fermentation. Which is, I think, part of why the original beer was designed the way it was and to ferment out as much as it was. But as we grew, we were no longer able to do that. We had to go to conicals. And so we're increasing the hydrostatic pressure. So that's when we started to tinker and realize that we were going to need to do more. So we've played around with oxygen levels a lot and validating our procedure to make sure we're getting enough oxygen in it. The quality of our yeast has gone up tremendously, I think, and that's been a big part of it. we've played around with different nutrients and our malt and water, make sure we have, enough zinc, and there's all the parameters are right for the highest level of fermentation that we can get, which basically is what it takes to get this beer to a balanced place.
Yeah. All of this kind of orchestration of all of these little pieces. So watching that all along the way has to, provide an interesting challenge for the entire staff there, making sure that every single one of those, pieces goes right. When things don't go right, what is usually the culprit for that?
It's us not following our processes for some reason, whether something breaks or user error, but
I was waiting for you to say it never goes wrong. We nail it 100% of the time.
It's been a while, luckily. But the number one reason would probably be yeast, or something terrible happens, like we run out of oxygen in the middle of knockout without realizing, or something like that. I mean, that would do it.
Yeah. When you say oxygen, I mean, obviously, streams are going to be different, but for you, how much, is there a point where there is too much oxygen?
Not that we've found in our processes. I mean, anything over a certain point flashes off, and it's not really possible once it gets into the fermenter, especially. So it's not really possible to saturate it with no pressure on the tank. I mean, other than hydrostatic pressure, our tank's not that big. So we haven't had any issues. Our brew house has a Venturi nozzle, which works pretty well. So we're able to dial that in pretty accurately.
Yeah. In terms of yeast cell counts, I mean, obviously you're measuring viability, and whatnot before yeast goes in there. And I know you guys have a lab that can do that kind of thing. But is there a cell count that you find ideal for that without over pitching it?
Not necessarily a specific cell count. I would think that we're targeting. We pitch everything by weight. We have a yeast kind of storage tank that it's got a mixer on it. It allows us to get really homogenized samples. We have a salometer, so we can get viability at 99%, and then it allows us to pitch very consistently, as opposed to pitching in a static vessel where it stratifies very quickly.
Yeah. Now, in the conical itself, are there any tricks to being gentle and babying that yeast? So, certainly temperature is going to play a role, but are there any other tricks that you all employ to kind of make sure that stays healthy?
In the storage tank?
In the fermentation tanks, yeah.
In the fermentation tank, it's just a matter of get it well dispersed and let it do its thing. When we store it, we do have a pretty specific, regime of what we do. We have it on the agitator on a certain timer, and we've kind of figured out exactly the least amount of shear, the least amount of agitation it takes to keep it homogenized.
Yeah. I do love watching the yeast propagation systems at larger breweries out here in Fort Collins, where I am. The New Belgium, yeast room is literally a small brewery. I mean, it is the size of some small craft breweries, with a similar number of tanks that are just there propping up, yeast. And certainly that's a scale that's, larger than you guys are, but that production of yeast piece of it is such an important overall part of the equation, and doing it well and making sure that you've got healthy yeast, and not have, when you're producing 30 some odd thousand barrels a year, you can't buy fresh pitches for everything. You'd go out of business real quick trying to be competitive selling beer if you were going through that kind of expense. Are there any other kind of peculiar behaviors, though, from your house ale yeast that you find that you all have to work around in that fermentation process?
I wouldn't say peculiar behaviors in fermentation. We're very careful with where we're harvesting it, because we're harvesting out of the cone. So there's definitely, if you harvest too early in the slurry in the cone or too late, you can get significantly different quality yeast. So we do have to be careful about that.
Yeah. And I guess that all ties into your SOPs where you know on which day on this brew after a certain point that it's going to be right to harvest, and then you can just pull out of that kind of golden time frame.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. How about water? How much does water play into this? You're in California. Water's a hot commodity, and certainly municipalities have to do a lot of treatment of varying kinds generally, given the strange path that water takes to get to you. How, what does that kind of process look like for you?
That's always a concern and a challenge, especially in San Diego of all areas. And we're in a drought again. We've been in many droughts, and so we track water from the Water Authority. We get a monthly report, like many breweries. We've tracked it since we started, and you can just see the total dissolved solids just creep up and up and up. I think right now we're something like 650, and the EPA's threshold for drinking water is 500. So it's challenging to work with. We're not quite big enough to afford a very nice and fancy, TDS blending system with RO and something that we can design different water profiles for every beer. So we use DI modules sometimes for certain beers to reduce as much as we can. But for most of our beers, we got to use it the way it is. That's where we are. That's the beers we make.
Right. You're going with the local terroir. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's the reality. Let's talk a little about hops in Speedway. There are hops in that beer. Maybe not the star of the show, but they definitely play a supporting role. What do the hops look like in Speedway, and why have you made some of the choices that you all have made?
So we prefer to use extract on the bittering side. It's just a lot more efficient and leaves a cleaner finish in the beer. The hops themselves are English varietals, in keeping with kind of the origin of the style from when the recipe was first made. The one unique thing about the beer is we do still use a lot of leaf hops in it in our hop back. Yeah. And part of the reason is physical. There's no true pile when making a beer like this. It's just a mass of hops and protein. So that allows us to filter the wort out for knockout much better. And it also adds, a different kind of quality of flavor of hop. It's fairly minimal in the end result, but it is noticeable and it is there.
That seems weirdly excessive to use whole leaf hops just in a hop back, to add that hop character and use it as a filter of sorts. Why go all for just that subtle character impact?
Well, yeah. So when I started, all of our beers used a hop back. That's always been kind of one of the defining qualities of Alesmith beers. As we've grown and we have newer beers, most of them no longer do, but we're still set up to use a hop back for a number of our beers. And so it's something we've just continued to do. We like the finished product that it gives us, and it helps make a cleaner wort, which I think is an important part of getting the fermentation correct on this beer and keeping it
sure clean. Interesting. Well, let's talk about coffee too, because of course this is a key component in Speedway, and I think we can go down a rabbit hole in talking about all of the varying coffees and then how you all adjust and work around those. But first, there's nothing easy about brewing beer. It's an intricate, time-consuming art. The last thing you need to face is a recall or contamination that can hurt your pride and your pocketbook. Clarion lubricants meet strict purity and performance standards to help make your system 100% food safe. That's protection for your equipment and your beer. So make the switch to Clarion and ensure your system is running smooth and safe. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. So this coffee piece of Speedway, there's a classic Speedway, that with its coffee component, and maybe we start there. And I'm curious, as you all think about this beer, how you balance, say, bitterness contribution, roastiness contribution, and balance that between malt and coffee, because coffee itself can add some of those same exact flavors and components in terms of bitterness and roastiness that roasted barley can. And then also, of course, you need that sweetness and some sort of and balance, to help offset some of these, sharper notes that these things can bring. But you also don't want to squash those flavor contributions of coffee itself. And you can think about coffee as producing a generic coffee flavor, but you can also think about coffee and all of the other flavors that it can evoke. For you all, how do you set parameters around that? Again, you use a lot of different coffees that may express themselves in different ways, in the beer. How do you set middle parameters for what your original Speedway is, and then think about how some of these other coffees impact it, and how beer might need to be adjusted, in some other ways for some of these other pieces?
Yeah, coffee is definitely one of the biggest variables. There's so much you can do with it, which also makes it kind of tricky. But the profile we're generally going for Speedway, for the year-round core Speedway, is something that's, we don't want to go, super roasted like a French or a City Plus or something, because that just contributes to the roasted barley, kind of the ashiness, and it doesn't come through well. But at the same time, we can't go as light roasted as a lot of the modern roasters would do, which is a coffee I would prefer, which has a lot more fruity notes, because those won't always translate, and they'll just kind of get dominated by the beer. So we're looking for something somewhat in the middle. It needs to have kind of a medium roast. We're looking for a complexity on the kind of coffee chocolatey roasty side, with notes of fruit and kind of caramel. So we always use a blend, because different coffee sources will dry up, and we don't want to be constantly just changing the entire coffee we're using. So we've tried to,
it's just like hops, you got to blend them in case there's changes like that. And
we've created a blend from coffees from different parts of the world. We have there's some Central American and some Southern American in it, that we think kind of creates that through trial and error, through cupping with the roaster we work with. But we, like you're alluding to, we make Speedways with many different kinds of coffee. So it does lend itself to a lot of creativity. But the important thing, like the base beer is designed to have coffee. So Speedway without coffee wouldn't necessarily be the same or as interesting of a product. So it always does, and it always will.
Yeah. How many different coffees go into this blend, typically speaking?
Usually 3.
3, yeah.
And we brew it in the house, which that process has changed a lot over the years, but there's potential risk of oxygen, because we're taking something that we're making hot and we're trying to cool it down, and that's been something we've really dialed in. Try to make as strong as possible, so we're adding as little water as possible unnecessarily, but that still captures those flavors.
So that's interesting. Certainly some of the folks that I've talked to do it the most ridiculously expensive way, which is conditioning the beer on whole beans, within the tank. Can create great tasting beers, but that is crazy expensive given the extraction and everything else. Grinds or crushed coffee, has all of its own challenges, especially if you're trying to do the extraction in beer with alcohol in a tank. And so what you're saying is that you brew a high strength liquid coffee and then, add that liquid coffee into the beer itself.
Yes, we have kind of our own process we feel like we perfected for the beer. We've tried it other ways, and I've had great beers all those ways that you're mentioning. I think for us, the risk of adding whole or ground beans to the beer itself is we usually pick up a lot of sulfur, which comes through in the finished product. And so we found that you have to make it, but it does depend on how you make it. So it's something that we've evolved over the years.
When you say it depends on how you make it, what do you mean by that?
Well, you can't just make a drip coffee and throw it in.
They don't make commercial size coffee filters, right? So that I can, just make a giant pot of drip.
I mean, we're making quite a bit of coffee at any one time for a tank full of Speedway, and so we can't use a coffee maker. So we've had to come up with our own equipment that we've kind of designed with manufacturer and a process to get the perfect saturation, like I said, as strong as possible, but we want to cool it down quickly. We want to keep as much grinds out of it. There's definitely a risk of acetaldehyde if you don't do it right. You're potentially adding oxygen as well. So it's kind of the equipment we use in the process. Our head brewer Anthony's dialed in.
So you have a specific piece of equipment in the brew house that just makes your coffee?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
It's an important part.
No. That feeds into the brewer FOMO piece. Now, we have our adjuncting tanks and our spin bot and our hop rocket, and I didn't know that I needed our puree cooker. There's no end to the pieces of equipment that one could have in your commercial brew house to do these things. But now I guess we can add your industrial, sized mega tank coffee,
Exactly. I mean, if you're going to do it, why not geek out on some cool equipment and do it right?
Yeah. How does it do that? I'm just curious because I have not really conceived of doing that, but what are some of the broad kind of parameters, imagine the time on the coffee matters and you want to, get in quick and get out quick. But if you want to make a thick liquid or, then that's certainly going to impact, extraction. You don't want to have to heat reduce this afterwards, because anytime you put heat on it, you're going to blow off some of the nice aromatic compounds potentially.
Exactly.
How does that work?
I think the important thing for us from our own research and trials is to monitor the bricks of the coffee, and you can use that metric as kind of a benchmark for not just the strength of the coffee, but how much the concentration of it. You have a known starting amount, so you're targeting a certain number that we know will get us the mix that we want and the flavor profile that we want, and then just keeping it as clean as possible, separating the grinds, and trying to cool it down as quickly as possible too.
Do you then work to kind of de-aerate that after it goes through that brewing process?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. We try to keep it from introducing oxygen as much as we can in the first place. But it's like you said, we don't want to blow CO2 through it,
right?
Because it will remove the aromatics that we're looking for. So you kind of got to prevent it from getting in the first place as much as you can.
Yeah. And just by creating a no oxygen environment for the entire kind of coffee brewing process to occur in.
Yeah, exactly.
Moving it from there, into the beer itself, is there anything about, that kind of, transfer and then mixture homogenization process? You're talking about adding a super thick liquid into another relatively thick liquid at that point.
Yeah. Well, you want it to get mixed really well. We usually add it during centrifugation in line, because we know that will mix the best.
That's interesting.
Have to worry about trying to mix it within a tank later or a stratifying or anything like that.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to sit together for very long. It just kind of happens in that at the end of that process to bring it together.
Yep.
Interesting. Yeah. And then I guess you're right. Since it's already been extracted into liquid, then there's not that process where it has to become part of the liquid itself.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about this kind of single varietal and how some of the single varietal process changes the equation with Speedway itself.
Well, that's a good question. So we have played around with lots of different coffees for Speedway, and sometimes we will pair adjunct ingredients or additives with a specific type of coffee that has a specific profile. So we'll try to balance flavors that we think go well together. Sometimes it's just a coffee that we're really excited about, that we think is unique, and that will come through in the finished product on its own, and that will provide something distinct and different than Speedway regularly is. So it's a matter of trying the coffee, finding the right coffee is the key, and then understanding what flavors are going to come through in the beer. And sometimes you can do that by simply brewing the coffee and doing little small trial tabletop blends with the beer. And then from there, building on top of that, if it is a beer that's going to have other different ingredients in it.
You guys have been doing this for a while, and I imagine you've got a pretty good mental picture now as you go through a cupping and are tasting some of these varieties to be able to think about what flavors do come through and what don't. Do you have any general rules of thumb around that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think generally the lighter fruity flavors don't come through as well. So things on the spectrum of apple or peach, things like that. The darker fruits, fig, raisin, those do come through better. I think the caramel notes can come through, and certainly, the chocolate roasty aspect of the coffee as well. That definitely comes through.
Yeah. As you've tasted them, are there some of those single varieties that you find personal favorites that just took it to a new or interesting place that you might have not expected?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've tried some really expensive coffees, and sometimes I'll find that those aren't necessarily my personal favorites, and it's the price has been built up over time from the rarity maybe. And other times we'll do something simple that I think is the best. But we've done a number of ones recently that I really enjoyed. It's not a single varietal, but we did a release with a coffee from Ostra. That one was a blend, but I really like that coffee. We sold the coffee at the brewery too, so people could try it on its own. It's called Ghost Bear. That one was one of the last couple of years, one of the ones that I was a big fan of.
They know a thing or two about getting coffee prepped for beer, and have kind of
they sure do.
They've done a nice job with that. No, how when it comes to now in addition to Speedway itself and the regular version of it, you also barrel age Speedway and and work through that. And it's been a little while since I've had some, so so I don't know where that program is actually right now. But fill me in a little bit on that and how any of these more. I don't want to call them extreme, but I would say these more elevated iterations of Speedway come into being. And is there any difference in the process around that? Because I imagine as you're adding coffee into a barrel aged beer, you might not be spinning it in a centrifuge and whatnot.
Yeah, it is a different process. So we still release variations of Speedway from barrels regularly. We also have a members only program called the Order of the Anvil, where a number of those beers are different iterations of Speedway with different adjuncts or different barrels or double barrel,
Right.
All kinds of different fun things. But
You can even, I remember at one point you all were even doing like, you could blend them in the special, Order of the Anvil bar,
yeah,
in the brew house itself. Right.
hell
If you
yeah,
wanted
we
to,
still
if you
do
wanted
that.
to make it even more complex, just make your own blend.
Hey, sometimes that's the most fun. You kind of be a part of it yourself.
Yeah.
When it comes to the coffee for Barrel Aged Speedway, there's a whole other element of the beer now you're introducing that you have to pair with the coffee. So it's not necessarily the same coffee that we would use otherwise. We've done so many different variations with so many different coffees that we only release like Barrel Aged Speedway on its own, once a year or so. I think we really recently released it with Vietnamese coffee, which is a whole different animal from regular coffee that most people are used to.
What makes Vietnamese coffee so different?
It's roasted with butter and cocoa, and so it tastes
So
like
just add a whole bunch of fats into your beer. Also, that's not gonna.
Well, we've never had any issues with that apparently, but
Good.
It's extremely like fine ground, and traditionally it's brewed with a little specialized fin filter. So we've had to try to mirror that process. I mean, we're not going to brew 2 ounces at a time for a whole batch of beer, obviously. Right. That was an idea that was introduced by one of our brewers about 5 or 6 years ago. But the finished product, it tastes like it has chocolate in it almost. It's extremely rich, and that's probably one of the most popular variations we do.
Do you change the base recipe if you know you're brewing for a different coffee like that, or do you just lean into it and let it go the way it's going to go to highlight that difference?
Definitely lean into it. So we're aging Speedway for anywhere from usually at least a year. We've got barrels 5 years old as well. So
wow,
it's a matter of finding the right barrel and finding what type of barrel was it. Has it been used before? The right spirit. So when it comes to barrel aging, it's a whole different ball game of variables that you have to select for before.
I see what you're saying. So rather than viewing it as a single stream process where you brew a specific beer, then put it into barrels, knowing it's going to have this kind of coffee, you instead are looking at what you have in the barrel cellar, the stock that you've developed, and then start thinking about how coffee might work with those specific barrels and how they've evolved and where they are right now. Exactly.
I mean, I didn't know 5 years ago what that Speedway we put in barrels was going to be used for this far out, but as is often the case. And so it's a matter of trying the beer and figuring out what it can become that will be really interesting.
Do you purposely then brew different types of, or brew Speedway for barrels that leans in some different directions so that you have a bigger blending palette to work from? So for example, when I was talking to Marty and Jim up at Revolution, they will specifically brew a high gravity version of stout or barley wine because it tends to age in a different kind of way, and they'll never release it as a single beer, but it just that sweeter base tends to pull elements of the barrel out in a different kind of way, and it just produces that nice little component of a blend, even though it's never going to be the similar beer. For you, as you're thinking about how we're going to eventually have to make some beer with coffee out of this down the road, do you think do you change some of those parameters, or do you kind of just work and let the barrel make that kind of decision for the beer?
With Speedway, we try to keep the beer the same. It's already a 12% beer. It's already got, fairly high final gravity for most beers. And I think I personally prefer a finished barrel-aged product that's not overly sweet as well anyway. By the time we're putting it in an unused barrel, it's usually 14 to 15% alcohol already. So it doesn't necessarily need to be stronger than that. But we do make other beers that are just for barrel aged, and those beers are designed to be barrel aged. And would probably never see an unbarrel aged version because it wouldn't be a beer that we would want to release. So, yes and no. No for Speedway, but yes in general.
Yes, for all of these other barrel projects that you all do. Are there any of those specific barrel projects that stand out for you that you found were particularly interesting or were fun diversions from your Speedway mainline?
Yeah. For our member club, we created a beer called Lost Profit. That's one of my favorites. So we've got 4 different imperial stouts that we run through the member club. So we had to kind of sit down and identify 4 different directions that would be unique and that wouldn't all taste like the same beer. So Lost Profit is a little bit lower alcohol. Pre-barrel age, it's closer to 11%, 10.5 to 11%, but it has a ton of like dark fruit flavors. We use like treacle in it and molasses. So it's got a whole different palate to it. And so then it's always barrel aged for the program. And so we'll do like a regular barrel aged version, and then we'll double barrel it and put a bunch of fun stuff in it. But the beer is always interesting because it's just got that fig and plum and raisin element to it.
It's funny because, those flavors used to be, what all imperial stouts, because of this kind of English base, that was where a lot of that flavor lied. And then, the age of chocolate came upon us and, it pretty much supplanted that idea of these dark fruits and these beers. And I love it because, when that happened, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, it tasted so great. It's like, oh, now we have this like cleaner chocolate character to these beers. And it's funny that we get to now at this point in history and we think back to those beers that we might have had 10 or 15 years ago. And we think about them fondly and we kind of want those things again. It seems to be as much as we talk about like time is not linear in the beer world, it is so cyclical. And I think
absolutely.
that, and especially now that we see people rediscovering, nobody lost West Coast IPAs on the West Coast. And, hazy beers did not supplant West Coast IPAs in a good portion of the country. But now across the board, we're seeing everybody remember again that, that those things have great flavors to offer. And of course, we approach things now, not as we did them then, but as we did them then, filtered through the lens of where we've gone since, and now we come back to it and it's a little bit different, but it also tastes these things. Anyway, I just love that kind of process that we move through, and I agree. It's nice to taste those flavors in these big beers, and I think we'll probably see a little bit more of that coming around again as the tyranny of chocolate in big imperial stouts starts to loosen its grasp. Anyway. So Ryan, before we get out of here, in a bigger question, what's next on the horizon for Speedway? Are there some challenges that you are interested in undertaking? Are there some creative ideas that you all want to explore, or where's it going to go from here? Or are you just going to keep making left turns and keep going around that track?
I see what you did there. There's always challenges. There's new and interesting things going on in the world of barrel aging. I think that is something that we look forward to. I mean, there's never enough time, so we're never at a point where we feel like we've saturated everything we can do. There's always new and fun things, and we don't necessarily know always what they are, but we know that the journey continues.
Well, I cannot wait to taste what you come up with because Speedway and Alesmith have not let me down on that yet. I really appreciate you talking with me on this episode of the podcast. G&D guarantees that every chiller they build will hit 28 degrees without breaking a sweat. Sativa is ideal for aroma, whirlpool, and dry hop additions to hazy and juicy IPAs. Old Orchard offers consistent product and reliable supply. Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. Of course, if you'd like to support this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button. If you're a pro brewer, hey, we've got these All Access Pro subscriptions, and we would love your support. And you get some of our exclusive content online free and first. Ryan, if people want to learn more about Alesmith or sample that Speedway or come and visit you guys, where do they find Alesmith?
They can always head to alesmith.com or on Instagram at Alesmith Brewing, and they're more than welcome to come to San Diego and stop by the brewery. We'd love to have them.
Fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you for this past hour just about Speedway Stout. I may be a little fixated here, but it was really fun to dive deep on that. Yeah. Cheers.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.